So I am the first speaker, and today I'm going to be talking to you about optimizing ICU design. Here are my relevant or not so relevant disclosures, depending on what you think. So travel support from Fisher and Paykel, and some methodology consulting support for Air Liquid. And I'm also a clinical practice guideline methodologist with the Guide Group. And in that role, I helped to develop the Society of Critical Care Medicine 2024 guidelines on ICU design. These were released just this week, so I highly encourage you after this talk or even during it to go download the guidelines, the executive summary. I'm just going to have a very brief overview of what these guidelines are talking about. And I'm very pleased to be presenting on behalf of this excellent panel. This guideline, interestingly, for an architecture and design guideline, we use grade methodology like we do for other guidelines in critical care medicine. We used a diverse panel of including architects, which I've never worked with as a critical care physician on a guideline, but also clinicians from across the spectrum of critical care: medical, surgical, nursing, allied health, subspecialties that work in the ICU, HVAC and air handling specialists, infection disease, infection control, really broad group of individuals, including many of whom outside of their professional role have also been patients or family members of ICU patients. We made 17 recommendations, 2 strong, 10 conditional, and 5 good practice statements. And I'll talk about what those are in a minute. The approach we used in making our decisions here was similar to that used in other grade guidelines. So we looked at the evidence, we did systematic reviews, and looked at the desirable and undesirable effects. But we also thought about things like values and preferences, the resources required, cost effectiveness, impacts upon equity, and acceptability and feasibility. When you're thinking about designing an ICU, there's evidence, but then there's also other aspects of design and the way it influences the way we work, the way patients are cared for. We grouped the recommendations into 5 major themes: layout, room design, infection control, infrastructure, and staff space. And consistent with other guidelines, for strong recommendations, we used the wording "we recommend." Conditional recommendations, we used "we suggest." And for good practice statements, these were used in a number of recommendations. Good practice statements, if you've not come across these are graded recommendations, so we don't have direct evidence supporting them, but there's a body of indirect evidence that are used to support these, and I'll give an example of this. And so I'm going to talk about the recommendations with a focus on those that are related to patient safety. But you'll hear all the recommendations. I'm just not going to go over all the evidence and reasoning for all of them. For that, you'll need to go for the whole guideline. So for the theme of ICU layout, we made 4 recommendations. First, a strong recommendation to design ICUs to have high patient visibility, specifically from the nursing or staff area to the patient, direct visual contact on the patient themselves. The second is we suggested having decentralized or centralized ICUs. We suggest that ICUs have single patient rooms rather than open bay layouts. So depending on where you practice in the world, there's a lot of variation. North America tends to have a lot of single patient rooms. European countries, some of them actually have open bay rooms, and staff in those areas often prefer them. I'm from Canada. We have a lot of emphasis on single rooms. The open bay rooms, though, allow the staff to visually keep tabs on one another and patients across the whole room. So there's looking at this from an evidence-based standpoint, we actually had some data on this. And lastly, we made a good practice statement saying that new facilities should locate critical care units as close as possible to frequently used and visited non-ICU care sites. So how did we use evidence to come up with ICU design recommendations? So here's an example: visibility and layout. So we looked and we found observational evidence suggesting that visibility, surprisingly, in the studies we saw, did not impact mortality when you look at all patients in the ICU. You can see the forest plot here. It's not statistically significant right there, like the little diamonds right on the line of no effect. However, when we looked at studies, and we tried to find studies that looked at high-risk patients, we found one that in patients with Apache scores greater than 30, they actually had a higher mortality rate in low visibility rooms. So when you sort of apply it to all patients in the observational data, which had issues with confounding, there was no difference, but in the highest severity patients, there seems to be perhaps a reduction in mortality with visibility there. But visibility also relates somewhat to the layout of the unit. If you've got an open bay versus single private rooms, those can impact visibility. So we looked at actually the single rooms versus open bay layouts. And what you can see here is that single patient rooms don't seem to impact mortality when compared to open bay layouts. Again, no statistically significant difference visible here. But when you actually look at hospital-acquired infections, there's a clear signal that single patient rooms result in less hospital-acquired infections. Again, it seems obvious, but when you think about it, if you have hand washing, if you have staff being very cautious, open bay layouts can have very excellent infection control processes, but the evidence would suggest that the single patient room is really the way to go in terms of preventing infections. Similarly, we found 2 studies that suggested that you actually have a reduced risk of delirium. Anyone who's been in an ER that's loud and noisy and tried to sleep for a few days there will know that delirium risk is going to go up if you can't sleep, if it's loud, and so single patient rooms seem protective there. We did find a single observational study that looked at adverse events like extubation. It suggested that open bay layouts might actually prevent those sorts of things, probably because in the open bay layout you can see almost every patient in the unit at once. So how do you interpret all of these studies? Because some studies had open bay layouts, some had single bedrooms, some had high visibility, some had low, and these studies were often sort of cross-contaminating one another. And so when we looked at the evidence, we said, you know what, high visibility, there's a signal that this is more important for sicker patients. It makes sense. If you have a sicker patient in an observational study, they're more likely to be in the high visibility rooms, and that might be negating the signal that we would expect to see by the high visibility being helpful, because who's going to be in the highest visibility rooms? I know in my unit, the nurses will already put the sickest patients there. So that might actually just be a sign that the sickest patients are going to do better if you put them in those rooms. Single bedrooms may reduce infection delirium risk. And so when you think about it, the ideal state is really one where you've got primarily, if not entirely, single bed rooms, but those spaces have to have visibility. So there's an important caveat here. Single bay rooms are useful in reducing infection delirium, but if they're all in a big line and you can't actually see all the patients there, eyes on the patient, you might be causing harm. Similarly, for ICU location, it was really hard to find evidence comparing ICUs that are closer and farther to key locations. But we did find indirect evidence suggesting that ICU proximity may be important. And that is because when you look at transfer data, transfers out of ICU to ER, or from ER to ICU, to radiology, to IR, wherever you're going, are actually associated with adverse events, pretty commonly, 26% of them in one study, and some of these are associated with serious harm, including a risk of mortality. Furthermore, this is a time-dependent relationship. The longer the patient is out of the ICU, the higher the risk of adverse events is. So on the basis of this evidence, we made a good practice statement that ICUs should be located near key locations of the hospital where patients are going to be transferred. So this is the difference between an evidence-based statement where we've got direct evidence, nice forest plots, and one where we're really relying on indirect evidence about transfer time to inform where the ICU should be. We could not make a formal graded evidence statement here, but we did make a good practice statement. What about room design? So we made 3 recommendations. Firstly, we recommend having windows and natural lighting in all patient rooms. We suggested noise reduction strategies to reduce ambient noise levels, and we suggested that either in-room or centralized supply room locations may be useful. Natural lighting, surprisingly, or not surprisingly, I guess, if you've been following critical care literature for decades, as many of us have, natural lighting does not impact mortality. And similarly, dynamic lighting, where the lighting changes, I have this in my house, I really like it, but does not appear to impact mortality. But you're saying, well, what about delirium? And surprisingly, despite earlier studies and some pilot studies suggesting otherwise, it doesn't actually appear to impact delirium. When you put all of the studies together, and these are observational studies of about 7,000 patients, there doesn't actually appear to be an impact on delirium. This took us by surprise. This was probably our most controversial recommendation because we expected to see delirium might be reduced by windows. And in fact, we made a strong recommendation for windows despite the evidence that it doesn't appear to reduce delirium. And this was on the basis of those other factors I talked about at the beginning of the talk. Equity, values and preferences. We were like, there's no world in which families and patients and staff are not going to want a window in the room if they have it otherwise. So even all things being the same, people are going to want to have a view of the outside world so their ICU does not feel like a prison. And similarly, if you put windows in all the rooms, you're now going to improve equity by ensuring that everybody has access to that same desirable resource. So this is one of those recommendations. It was really controversial. We went back and forth a whole lot. But when you look at accreditation requirements, this was something that making a recommendation against Windows didn't make sense, and in fact would be against accreditation requirements for many ICUs across the United States and Canada. So we actually made a strong recommendation in favor of Windows. We made a conditional recommendation for noise reduction strategies. There's many of these. Most of them, you can see that they reduce noise levels that are often above workplace standards, but we actually don't know if they improve patient outcomes. Infection control, I'll just briefly touch on. We looked at advanced HVAC systems using ultraviolet light and these kinds of things. We didn't actually find that any evidence suggesting they improved outcomes. This is sort of an area, a space to be looked at in the future. But we did make a good practice statement that ICU should incorporate advanced infection prevention features. And these varied between units. Some units have a problem with sinks, Pseudomonas, and there's devices that help that. There's airborne and there's surface-borne transmission. Various ICUs are going to have issues with these, and in the document we talk about, you really need to talk to your local infection prevention and control folks to figure out what strategies are right for the unit you're designing or building. For the question of infrastructure, so we suggest designing ICUs with capacity for monitoring and controlling devices outside of patient rooms. We suggest building ICUs with tele-ICU capacity. We also made a good practice statement that ICU design should plan for surges in patient volumes considering ICU space in novel hospital spaces. And we suggested non-wall-based life support utilities access be used. So this would be pillars or booms as opposed to the flat wall. You'll see here, this guideline, we did this during COVID. Anyone who worked in ICU during COVID sees this theme coming out right here. We need to control things outside of the room. We want to be able to do this. We need to be able to expand our scope and capacity. The interesting question is that of telemonitoring. So there's lots of observational evidence suggesting that tele-ICU can reduce mortality, okay? Randomized control trials, some of which came out just as we were finishing this guideline, actually don't show that same difference. The telescope trial, which was done recently in Brazil, had daily rounds and monthly audits of ICUs, did not show any difference in mortality with the tele-ICU. So despite this limited evidence, we sort of looked at, well, what about ICUs across the country? This is a question of tele-ICU will be more helpful if you're in a small ICU, limited access to critical care expertise. So that's why we made a conditional recommendation. Last topic is staff space. So firstly, we suggested using ergonomic designs in the ICU, and we talk about what those are in the guideline. We also said ICUs should include dedicated staff break rooms, for which we did not find evidence, but sort of seemed like something that we needed to make a statement about. But there is some emerging evidence about these quiet rooms and respite spaces, in addition to sort of where staff put their lunch and their coat and all that kind of stuff. Separate quiet rooms that might actually improve staff mental health. And so we made a conditional recommendation for these on the basis of some emerging evidence. And lastly, that ICU design should actually permit. We didn't mandate, but we said should permit the use of mobile workstations or devices. The idea that you need to future-proof your ICU so that as things change, you need to be thinking forward about what technologies are coming down the pipe. So, in conclusion, surprisingly, for me at least, I've never worked on a guideline like this, but evidence can really inform aspects of ICU design. These can be studied, they can be evaluated, and you can use that to inform your ICU design. That being said, you do need to always adapt to your local context, and a lot of our guideline discussions were like, here's the evidence, how do we use it in the real world? How do we use it in a big hospital, a small hospital, a renovation? I think it's important to keep an open mind about what may work. We were very surprised by some of the evidence here, stuff around Windows, that was very surprising to our group. So it's important to keep an open mind about what's helpful and what's not, the positives and the negatives. And lastly, ICU design can impact patient safety and quality of care. Most of the outcomes we looked at were about patient safety. And so thinking about ICU layout, room design, infection control, infrastructure, and staff space, crucially important topics. So I highly encourage you to go and read the full guideline. I've given you just a little taste of what's in it, and I've not done justice to the exceptional work of the entire panel, but I also especially want to thank the guideline leadership team here on the slide. I know some of them are listening in virtually. This project was led and driven by real experts in this field, and I was so honored to be able to help out with the methods on it. So with that being said, I think I'm just about on time, holding myself accountable. There's a plus. And so it's my honor and privilege to introduce our next speaker. So this is Dr. Julian Goldman from Massachusetts General Hospital, and he's going to be discussing the importance of device operability with regard to safeguards, efficiency, patient safety, why it is achievable with current technology, and the barriers to getting our devices to speak with one another in the ICU. So I'm really looking forward to your talk, Dr. Goldman.
Any questions? So I will have a number of QR codes for those of you who have your phones ready. They'll be interspersed, so be ready. Thank you. Thank you. Simon, thank you very much. Great to be here, and I'm going to take you through a journey of information to a specific point in time right now where I think we have tremendous opportunity for change. I mentioned that you should be prepared for a few QR codes, so if you're too far away, move closer to the screen. I have no conflicts to disclose. How many of you were at the meeting last year where we took this picture? Oh, okay. This will be clearer, but I wanted you to see. This is the first QR code, by the way, if you caught that. Smart and Autonomous Medical Systems Collaborative Community Kickoff Meeting at last year's Critical Care Congress meeting. See if you may recognize some of the folks in the photo. And maybe we'll have a chance to take another one soon. Well, for those of you who've been practicing for a while, how much has this scenario changed in the last few decades? Sadly, not enough. It's still very difficult to introduce new technologies to improve efficiency and reduce error, and this is an OR, but it isn't much different in other high acuity areas. You may have a great idea and even have a great technology that you can obtain, you can buy, you could build, but deploying it is extremely complicated. How about just knowing the right time? The medical devices we use in the systems don't interconnect, unlike our smartphones. They don't even know what time it is. When you perform an accident analysis or clinical study, that's a problem. And so even though we're seeing the application of advanced algorithms and AI all over the place, moving that into the clinical area has been challenging. And by the way, this photo was taken quite a while ago, but it actually was a very highly modern environment, and you can tell because the monitor has a color screen, as do the infusion pumps, which was, I think, the greatest innovation in that prior decade or two. Now, this is something from 2005. The Anesthesia Patient Safety Foundation, in their winter newsletter and their workshop, talked about the unfortunate death of a 32-year-old patient having a laparoscopic cholecystectomy. They turned off the ventilator, left the room to get the x-ray, and then forgot to turn it back on in a timely period because they were preoccupied with a problem with the x-ray cassette. Now, this is a problem that's quite rare, but you have to ask yourself, why do we turn off a ventilator to get an x-ray? Those of you who've done, involved in photography and other things, you synchronize things, right? You don't turn one off and hope you turn it back on. And for those of you who, like me, are anesthesiologists, or if you work in environments where, say, there's interventional procedures and radiology, neurosurgery, you turn off the ventilator all the time and rush away and rush back. You have to say, why don't we have a way to synchronize those? Hold that thought. 2006, Anesthesia Patient Safety Foundation newsletter, Dangers of Postoperative Opioids. A particularly attractive feature may be the ability to automatically terminate or reduce an infusion when the monitoring technology detects that the patient is deteriorating. There is a product on the market that does that, only one. You might ask yourself in this age where we can develop algorithms easily and have smarter algorithms that are maybe patient-specific, environment-specific, and so on, why don't we have these everywhere? And for those of you who aren't as familiar with the PCA, the problem is not only, we're depending upon the patient to be too sedated to push their button, and so that way they don't overdose themselves. However, PCA by proxy, a family member may push the button. There can be dosing errors, sensitivity errors, concurrent medications, a whole lot of reasons why a patient can receive an overdose. So why not have systems where you can detect respiratory depression early and stop the pump and alert the clinical team. 2011, APSF newsletter. Again, no patient shall be harmed by opioid-induced respiratory depression. Wait, the first one was 2005. Why in 2011 are we still writing about patients being harmed by opioid-induced respiratory depression? Why is technology not helping us to eliminate these problems and improve patient safety? So opioids are one area, but what if the smart system could detect the adverse cardiorespiratory effects of antibiotic reactions, transfusion product reactions, chemotherapy reactions, and stop an infusion in time to prevent patient harm and call for help and do all the things that are appropriate? Hold that question. So we can do that. Of course we can do that. We just have to use the data that we're collecting today that's in the EHR. It's readily available, and we can build smart algorithms, right? Well, I don't know. Can you? Let's see. This patient's heart rate goes from 79 to 170 on the pulse ox waveform, and yet there's no real change to the patient. So this is a misinterpretation of the waveform. And so if we were to use just the pulse rate from the pulse oximeter for a smart algorithm, the algorithm wouldn't be so smart. And here's the EHR data, and you see the pulse rate jumping up and down, even though there's really no change to the patient. Then you might say, well, we could fix this easily. Let's just take this waveform and ship it off to the manufacturer, and they can improve their device. Because we would get that waveform from where? We don't store that data. We can't return that data to the manufacturer to ask for improvements in our technology. So all we have is a picture of the EMR. Well, I guess we can use the EC. Well, that's a little problem. This diagnosis here is asystole. I don't know how many of you treat patients, but if you were to treat asystole, I think everyone would have a bad day on that diagnosis. So how many of you know enough about how to write an algorithm or software that you can write a smarter algorithm that would not have an asystole alarm because you looked at the arterial blood pressure waveform and pulse ox and everything else? Right? Probably anyone who's ever programmed for more than 2 hours. In theory, implementation a lot harder for a robust algorithm that's FDA cleared, but really? Now, I won't go into all of these, but these are all published examples. This was a text I received that the patient just went into Brady at 30. You look at the EMR, and there's no record of the heart rate below 45. Or SATs that are missing in the EHR. This was true that the SpO2 was 84 at one point, but that's missing from the EHR because it's averaged out by the sampling. Or the pulse, or the NIBP inflates, and you have low blood pressures, and those do end up all the time. And so what data should we use to build smart systems and to improve patient safety? Now I'm going to slightly switch gears, and this will all make sense in a moment. In 2014, we were contacted by the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy and said, hey, Ebola virus disease is coming to this shore. What could we do to leverage technology to improve safety? So we held an event supported by the NIH and others, and in 20 days, 20 companies came together. 20 days, 20 companies. So we just talked about in a decade and almost nothing happened. And there are events where 20 days you have 20 organizations, academic organizations and companies. It resulted in prototyping of remote control for Ebola virus disease. And this is my old lab and a young me. And mannequin hasn't aged. And the FDA participated on site in the lab, and which was a very powerful statement by the FDA. And we all worked together to show that you could control devices from outside the room, and to a limited extent, even back then. But it started to make people comfortable with the idea that if you could connect to a medical device through its electronic interface, not only could you manually control it, maybe from right outside the room or from far away, but you could use algorithms to control the device. Well, along comes the public health emergency, COVID-19, and we all know what happened with all the equipment in the hallway. And interestingly enough, just prior to the pandemic, Nihon Kohden Orange Med produced a ventilator, a critical care ventilator, the NKV550, which was cleared by the FDA to be remotely controlled by a 10-meter cable. Here you see the cable running through over the OR at MGH as we set this up. Why a 10-meter cable? Why not wirelessly? Why not over the internet? Well, a couple of you are raising your eyebrows and saying, it's a little more complicated to do that. You have to make sure it's the right patient, and there's cybersecurity issues. So there's benefits, but there's also complexity to tethering things with a cable. But this way, at that time, this ensured line of sight deployment. But it also was challenging for the pandemic, for doing the things we all needed during that very difficult time period. So As you see on the right, the FDA released what they call enforcement policy or immediate in effect guidance in 2020 that said, you know, if you have a product on the market and if you want to add remote control to the product, you are allowed to do it, if it's a ventilator, an infusion pump, or a monitor. And so Medtronic added remote control capability for the PB980, and this also conformed to a standard that we developed. It was an emergency standard that we developed within AAMI, AAMI, and these are freely available online, by the way, these standards from this era. And this is our lab at MGH. We set the system up. We tested a number of functions and different scenarios for implementation, including the network requirements. And then I was at home having some coffee and took this screenshot from 8 miles away over a secure connection as I controlled the ventilator. So this is a conceptual, this is a, this is an internet picture that someone put together, and it's a great illustration of the notion of having an integrated clinical environment where you have some kind of platform, whatever that looks like, some computer connected to the devices, where you have all the data that you actually need at the resolution that you need, the timeliness that you need, with the waveforms that you need, and is kind of all-knowing platform in which you can start deploying the kind of intelligence that we need. This work led to the development of a standard called the ICE standard for the Integrated Clinical Environment, which was recognized by the FDA a number of years ago. During the pandemic, our team and others were funded by the Department of Defense and HHS to work on prototyping virtual critical care as examples of smart and autonomous medical systems. This is a photo from inside a tent at Tatrick in Fort Detrick, the Army's Telemedicine and Advanced Technology Research Center, in which you have an infusion pump, a ventilator, a physiological monitor, and an ICE platform all connected and all being used by a intensivist in Washington State to help manage this simulated emergency and adjust, not only read the data, but adjust those devices remotely. So what are smart and autonomous medical systems, or SAMs? Well, these are just examples. Automated closed loop of intravenous anesthesia, or ACLEVA. And there are products in some countries that exist, others that are emerging, that infuse the usual suspects of propofol, an opioid, and potentially a muscle relaxant, and close the loop using processed EEG. There are safety interlocks. The example I provided before of stopping something and not restarting it, but stopping it and calling people over to the bedside, you would call that a safety interlock, not a closed loop control, because it doesn't restart it. And that's a formal definition from standard. You can have closed loop vasopressor therapy. This was done decades ago, harder to do today. Remote control, as we talked about, of pumps and ventilators are kind of the key Lego ingredient to successfully building these systems. But getting those to market has been quite the challenge. So here's a little more descriptive way of looking at what are SAMs. Well, they describe smart medical systems. So you can, I think this definition and the information here is self-evident. And the idea that this fits in our vision of patient safety and healthcare transformation should also be self-evident. We need the medical technology ecosystem to evolve more so that we can bring these clinical ideas to practice and get the new technologies to the bedside. So in support of that notion in general, around 2019, 2020, the FDA created the notion of a collaborative community to address challenges together and to work on technology pre-competitively. Look at these broader issues so that so many companies and others can all contribute to a new vision of medical technology. We used the pathway that the FDA created, the collaborative community pathway, to form the SAMS, Smart and Autonomous Medical System Collaborative Community, which was approved by the FDA on May the 30th, and this is from the FDA's website. So the SAMS collaborative community started with the following projects. The first one, automated closed loop IV anesthesia, but we also have to then work on these pumps. How can we obtain controllable infusion pumps and devices that are interoperable? By the way, the diabetes technology, ecosystem has developed that, and there are infusion pumps and sensors and algorithms that are sort of interoperable, pretty darn close. And we need a means to test these things and ensure that they will be safe. We need a means to ensure clinical input that these things will do the right thing. So the first project that we've been working on is ACLEVA. And we've been fortunate that there has also been an Army, a U.S. government grant to MGH that's helped us support this work. We are not building the technology, we're not building product as part of our work, we're sorting out the safety issues and the clinical needs and the interoperability needs so that manufacturers can then develop these products and move through the regulatory pathway already knowing what the issues will be. We held our inaugural symposium on SAMs in June 2024. There are 2 QR codes on this slide. The upper right will take you to the page with the agenda and the slides, which will also take you on that page to the YouTube videos from the day's presentations. And so we have societies that are involved from the ASA and APSF, STA, and of course we had that seminal meeting last year at SCCM, and you saw the photo in the beginning. So here's a nice big QR code, and if you're interested in getting involved in this work, this will take you to a sign-up page where you could indicate your area of interest. Now, where will this work go and what kind of traction should we see? Well, we talked about the notion of ACLEVA and externally controllable infusion pumps and the importance of having those. And I'm just going to jump ahead. Now, something else that's going to move this forward in a rocket ship-like trajectory is that I'm pleased to share with you that we have just started working on an ARPA-H contract for something called Paradigm. And you could just take a look on the ARPA-H website and read about Paradigm. And Paradigm is a platform for the acceleration of rural access to distributed and integrated medical care. And we're developing Paradigm ICE, which you now know stands for the Integrated Clinical Environment. So the Paradigm program, this information is on the ARPA-H's website, will develop electric vehicle platforms for care anywhere and hospital-level care over time, becoming smarter and smarter and safer, with capabilities that you see on the left. As a component of that, our team is developing a medical Internet of Things platform, or ICE platform, that will be part of the Paradigm program. And you can learn more about this. This is, by the way, a diagram of what an ICE architecture looks like, but we don't have the time to go into that. So this is information. I'm going to go backward to make it easier for you to scan that QR code if you didn't, because it will take you to a page that will help, will have a lot more information and lead you in the right direction. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. We'll have time for questions in the end, and thank you very much.
I don't think we needed a moderator because everyone's moderating themselves at this point. Pretty amazing. So thanks so much. Our next speaker, and how do I switch? I'm going to let you do that. I'll do the talking. Play to our strengths. Our next speaker is Dr. Paul Bergl. Dr. Bergl's at Gunderson Lutheran Medical Center, and he's going to be discussing emerging technology in AI and using this with the EMR to help promote diagnostic accuracy and mitigate error. So this is yet another aspect of patient safety and technology, and a really hot topic, so very excited to hear about this.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. So yes, we're going to talk about enhancing diagnostic accuracy and envisioning the future of critical care. This is still a big issue that is pervasive in critical care. Rates of diagnostic error have stubbornly been stuck at 10 to 20% of all ICU patients. So thinking about how can we leverage our technology as we try to improve outcomes of our patients. Outcomes hinge highly on accurate and timely diagnoses, so hopefully I can convince you of that over the next 15 minutes. I am an intensivist. I work mostly clinically. I have spent a lot of time, though, thinking about diagnostic error, doing a little bit of research on it, and teaching about clinical reasoning over the years. So the first thing I was tasked with talking about is diagnostic accuracy as a dimension of safe, high-quality care. And again, I will just kind of pose this rhetorical question of what could possibly matter more. Accurate, timely diagnoses are critical to getting the best patient outcomes. And as I already alluded to, unfortunately, the scope of the problem is still large. If you look at ICU-specific studies, and this is from the last 5 years, this is not old historical data, 10 to 25% of patients admitted to an ICU have or will have suffered a major diagnostic error resulting in significant morbidity and mortality. These are not the minor mistakes or the mislabeling of things that we may make from time to time, but like real errors that result in real harm. If you look more broadly at settled malpractice claims, diagnostic errors are the largest source of settled malpractice claims in this country, in the United States, and they're not inconsequential things. Serious harm is found in greater than 60% of them, And of these settled malpractice claims, death is directly attributable to diagnostic error is found in 33% of these settled claims. So what diagnoses are implicated? You might think, well, this is esoteric stuff, rare things, things I didn't know about. But the reality is from all these recent and historical ICU-specific studies, it's stuff that all of us know an awful lot about and see probably every day. Pulmonary embolism, myocardial infarction, bacterial pneumonia. Now, there are a couple surprises on this list. You know, invasive aspergillosis is actually more common. You probably realize it's one of the more common diagnostic errors discovered at autopsy, and that's probably just due to limitations still in our ability to diagnose it and the limitations of the diagnostic tests we have for it. Similarly, again, if you look more broadly and looking at settled malpractice claims, diagnostic errors are common diseases. These are called the big three by experts in the field of diagnostic error. And two of these three categories, again, are things that are probably like happening in 80% of patients in any ICU on any given day. Vascular events like stroke, myocardial infarction, pulmonary embolism, infections. So why would we err, you might wonder? On the one hand, on the one end of the spectrum, you can just think about the clinician's mind, right? Like clinicians are susceptible to cognitive failure. We're all human. We might have a failure to consider a diagnosis. There might be misinterpretation of diagnostic tests. We may have inadequate knowledge about the diseases in front of us. On the other end of the spectrum are things that are purely within the realm of the system and the environment. There might be just poor communication systems resulting in communication failures, or errors in diagnostic test processing and resulting, the wrong hemoglobin for the wrong patient gets put in the chart. Those types of things are uncommon. We've spent an awful lot of energy and time and resources over the years in improving our systems. But we still have this big intersection of the two, and that's the intersection of the clinician and the system. And if any of you were in this room yesterday afternoon at this very same time, that was sort of the essence of the entire talk, was interruptions, cognitive load, all of the parts of our environment and our systems that negatively impact our cognition. It's a lot harder to think if you're being constantly interrupted, or if things are beeping, or you're attending to 4 information streams at once. So the most errors probably occur at this intersection, that we just don't have perfect systems that then inhibit our ability to think clearly or quickly. There's this axiom in quality and safety: if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. And that's a big problem in diagnostic error. We still don't really have great ways of defining this problem. So unlike CAUTI, CLABSI, and VAP, an operational definition for measurement of diagnostic error is proven elusive, and you can sort of see why. There's a lot of things like, okay, well, what is an error? Or what is a what is a no-fault miss? If a patient doesn't tell me their full medical history, or I have no access to that, or they don't tell me some substance they're abusing that I have to later discover, that's not necessarily, nobody's necessarily at fault for that. Similarly, like, what is timely versus delayed diagnosis? In the ICU, we have a lot of time-sensitive stuff, but an hour, 2 hours, 4 hours, like, what is the time point at which we should diagnose sepsis, or a new stroke, or mesenteric ischemia? How accurate and specific should diagnoses be? A lot of us probably use terms like toxic metabolic encephalopathy, and our patients eventually wake up, but was that the right diagnosis, or did we miss something along the way that just happened to get better over time? And do we have objective reference standards? Do they exist for the diagnosis in question? So for a lot of things, it's clinical diagnosis, right? Even pneumonia, like, how often do we disagree with our colleagues about whether or not somebody had pneumonia? So if we don't have these preconditions, it's really hard to measure diagnostic error and thereby improve it. I'd say the organization leading the charge in this is AHRQ or ARC. Still, though, there are not universal ways to measure this. However, they've tried to move the needle. They've developed policy briefs, toolkits. There are tools for conducting chart review, for self-evaluation, peer evaluation, patient and family engagement, and they've spent a lot of time promoting resources for communication and situational awareness training. Recognize that if those things improve, then the diagnostic process is likely to improve, since diagnosis has become such a team sport, especially in the ICU, where team-based care is the name of the game. So I want to talk a little bit more about emerging technologies for enhancing diagnostic accuracy. And I guess I'll just say up front, I don't think this is going to be as sexy as you'd think, because I'm going to sort of talk about one part of diagnosis, which is this middle part of this conceptual model of the diagnostic process. This is where cognition occurs, I think, for most clinicians, in which we're doing information integration and interpretation, coming up with working diagnoses, doing more information gathering, basically iterative hypothesis testing. And there is not a technological solution directly for that. I'm not going to talk about how technology is going to improve diagnosis over time, new diagnostic tests, et cetera. All of that's going to help, but I'm talking about is there technology that's going to enhance our cognition? And I think most of you are probably naturally thinking about artificial intelligence, a big theme for this talk. Awesome plenary yesterday morning by Dr. Chirpek. but I still don't know that it's ready to totally enhance cognition. So when we think about something like ChatGPT or other large language models in the diagnostic reasoning, on the one hand, you hear people very much in defense of this. Like, it's going to make us obsolete, right? You'll find inflammatory headlines like this. There's one hard question my fellow doctors and I will soon need to answer, which is basically implying that we're going to be useless when computers can do all of the diagnosis for us. And there have definitely been studies in the last year that have shown that some parts of the diagnostic process are really done very well by large language models. So GPT-4 outperforms medical students on free response clinical reasoning examinations. GPT 3.5 writes HPIs just as well as internal medicine residents and attending physicians. GPT-4 solves complex cases better than the average journal reader from published cases in medical journals. On the other hand, these are parts of the diagnosis or forms of diagnosis, but it's not like the real world work that a lot of us do. And it has been shown that doctors perform worse when they're supported by biased AI. So if we're relying on this, we're actually going to make the good clinicians potentially worse if we start feeding them information from a biased AI algorithm. This was a great study done this past year that doctors do not perform any better when supported by large language model as compared to conventional resources. So they took a bunch of clinicians, they said you can use UpToDate, this, whatever, and then the other group, they said here's what the large language model will suggest as diagnoses for you. And those clinicians in practice didn't do any better with the large language model suggestions. It basically just affirmed the things they're already thinking about. Similarly, I showed that this GPT-4 can outperform medical students. However, this was just published in the last few months that doctors outperformed GPT-4 on the Swedish Family Medicine Specialist examination. This is not multiple choice or short answer. This is like thoughtful deliberation that has to occur and be written out. And these large language models are not yet as sophisticated as those going into family medicine in Sweden, at least. Now, there's definitely uses that are like probably everywhere that I'm sure have proliferated into all of your ICUs, and I think that the evidence continues to suggest that diagnostic technology enhancement based on visual data is exceptional. So I don't know if you're like me in our ICU, we get chest radiographs that now show where the endotracheal tube is and how far it is from the carina, and shows you if the patient might have a pneumothorax. Sometimes it's just apical emphysema, sometimes it actually is, but it's pretty good at picking out things visually, visual pattern recognition. We have CT scans that come back with volumetric measurements of the blood, so not only does it say there's an intraparenchymal bleed, but it will measure it for you. Our point-of-care ultrasound machine measures the left ventricular outflow tract velocity time integral. It takes me a matter of seconds to compute a stroke volume because the machine recognizes, oh, that's what you're measuring, and automatically computes that curve. So those visual recognition tasks are great, but it's not fully the diagnosis, right? It's still part of the diagnostic process. Again, whole talks on this in this conference, a whole half-day seminar on Saturday that I didn't get to attend, but thinking about computational modeling and early diagnosis, I'll just say that these are very good, but still I don't think replace the excellent diagnostician. So if you look at the range of C statistics in a one commercially available sepsis prediction model, which many of you may have in your hospital, I won't name the organization or the company, these C statistics are great to exceptional, 0.823 to 0.882. If you don't remember, the C statistic of 1 is perfect diagnostic test. C statistic of 0.5 is a coin flip. So these are really good models. However, if you go into the white paper that this EHR company publishes and you look at the variables they're including, it's a lot of human cognition going into it. So human variables in their sepsis prediction model include the number of peripheral IVs the patients received, the number of IV medications that have been ordered, abnormal findings on nursing assessment, and whether ECG or imaging has been performed. In other words, it's just picking up on clues that we as clinicians are worried about this patient and are doing more to this patient to identify them as septic. And I thought this was a beautiful study. If you haven't seen this, this is probably like maybe my favorite study in the whole talk. It was done in an emergency room, I think in Minnesota, Twin Cities this past year, and they tested human gestalt in diagnosing sepsis in the first 15 minutes, and they compared it to a bunch of other models, SOFA-score, SIRS, Muse, but the last one was a machine language model, and the clinicians outperformed all of those things, including the machine language model. The ER physician was able to identify sepsis, and it was adjudicated down the line. This is, adjudicated later after the fact, nearly perfectly in the first 15 minutes, better than any of these technologies or scoring systems. So are there other ways that we can use technology to improve diagnostic accuracy in the ICU over time? And I think a lot of it actually goes back to how can we develop systems, improve systems, but also enhance systems to improve the feedback we get. So firstly, if all of us probably recognize and acknowledge that diagnosis occurs in a very dynamic space like this, right? Like all of these parts of this picture are impacting our ability to make accurate diagnoses. The clinical environment, the organizational culture. Are there ways to deploy technology to understand how all these things are talking to each other? Are there ways to use technology to enhance error recognition in the ICU? And there absolutely are. One is actually a relatively simple idea of a trigger or e-trigger. It's basically just building a red or yellow flag either into the EHR or into the workflows to say this patient's at higher risk of having an error. So the classic example used for this is a patient who comes to an emergency room, is diagnosed with dizziness or vertigo, gets sent home and comes back 3 days later with a stroke. Well, we probably missed the stroke the first time and we mislabeled it. So it's these sort of patterns of care utilization or yellow or red flags that you can sort of build into the EHR to pick up on potential cases of error. And if you build them the right way, they have a positive predictive value of almost greater than 50%. Maybe I was dismissing large language models a little bit earlier, but they actually could be very helpful for reviewing charts. So natural language processing review of a chart is actually very good at helping pick out error. So not just using the quantitative data, but looking at the things we're all writing and typing in free text, it actually can really be useful for enhancing error detection. This is all done after the fact, but I can imagine this would even be useful in real time at some point based on the language we're typing into patient's notes or something like that, saying, hey, maybe this is a patient who's at higher risk for a diagnostic error. For a number of years, people have talked about virtual autopsy, and I'm still not aware of any place that routinely does this. But I will say that the most recent meta-analysis published just this past year in intensive care medicine showed that 5 to 20% of ICU patients who undergo autopsy have major misdiagnoses that result in harm or death. And if there was a way to send all these patients through a CT scanner and draw some sort of 100-panel biomarker panel or something like that from them before they died, we might be able to pick up more things than relying on traditional autopsy, another form of technology. Patient and family reported, there could be potential multiple data sources there, patients that fill out surveys or things like that. All of that could feed back into error recognition. But perhaps something I'm interested, I don't do a lot of, but I'm very interested in learning more about is EHR metadata. So this is not the white count or the systolic blood pressure trend, but this is how many times people accessed a certain person's chart, or they ordered a medication and they stopped it, or they ordered a diagnostic test and they canceled it. All of those things are captured by the EHR platform, and are there patterns in those types of things that happen on a day-to-day basis that could signal, oh, this is a patient we should be more worried about, or is at higher risk for diagnostic error? So if 7 different clinicians access a patient's chart in 1 hour, and they go back in 10 minutes later over and over and over again and hit refresh on some lab value, maybe that's somebody that, is, I guess we're all sort of super vigilant and paying attention to that person for a reason, but all these types of patterns, ways to kind of flag patients or flag charts for review after the fact, or again, in real time, are these ways to identify patients at higher risk for error. I'll just wrap up by saying experts in cognition agree that high accuracy in diagnosis requires feedback, and feedback involves ongoing calibration or learning from your mistakes, but also learning from the things you got right. And with our low-tech solutions already out there, we might enhance those with technology. So I think a lot of it's chart stock, but is there a way of sort of generating an automated list of charts for chart stocking? There's different tools out there, error reporting systems, post hoc electronic feedback people have used, like, oh, do you know this patient 2 months ago that you saw? Here's what happened to them. But again, I think there might be some higher tech solutions that can still allow us to gain feedback even if we don't have somebody else watching us. Can natural language processing review of our own notes give us feedback over time about our accuracy of our diagnoses? Or can we start to develop advanced performance metrics in the EHR? For example, just take the example of pulmonary embolism and say, hey, here's the yield of your CT scans for detecting pulmonary embolism. Your 3 standard deviations too low, so you're ordering way too many tests, or your 3 standard deviations too high, you're probably missing a lot of pulmonary emboli based on the yield of your CTPE studies. I'll wrap it up here. There was a full 20-minute talk on cognitive load yesterday. Then I'll just do disservice to this topic. I would recommend go on your Congress digital app and listen to that talk after the conference if these types of things interest you. But there might be ways, again, to kind of enhance the environment that reduces cognitive load, and technology certainly has probably a major role in all of that. Here's a full list of references if any of this stuff catches your eye. It's a Google document that has every single thing I referenced and sped through. My residents say rounding with me is like watching YouTube on 1.5 speed, so thanks for putting up with me for the last 15 minutes and we're happy to take any questions, I think, right?